I'd like to call this hearing to order this morning. Today we are going to have a legislative hearing on H.R. 4255, the Accountability and Grants Act, which was introduced recently. And I might say that all of us, when we're back home in our districts, hear people talk all the time about the federal debt. And as you know, it's now around $16 trillion. And they're always asking the question, why is it that you all in Washington cannot seem to ever get spending under control? And we all know that there's not one piece of legislation that's going to solve that problem. But this is one piece of legislation that many of us believe is a small step in the right direction, and it does involve real money, but in many ways I think we could say that it's really a symbolic gesture that does save money. Now, our friends on the other side of the aisle had a memo that they sent out on this legislation, and it says the data does not support the majority's assertions that the Obama administration has intensified grant making from EPA for international activities that do not benefit the American people. Well, I would say, first of all, I introduced this legislation. I've never asserted that the Obama administration intensified grant making for international activities. I'm simply saying that ever since the Clean Air Act was written, this Section 1703 has been in there allowing money to be spent for international purposes through grants out of EPA. And the Bush administration did it, Obama administration did it, the Clinton administration did it, so everyone's doing it. But the purpose of this legislation is simply to take one small step to show the American people that at this time in our nation's history, when we have a $16 trillion federal debt, that yes, at least temporarily, let's stop international grant making through EPA. And I'm not even going to argue that there hadn't been some benefit in these grants. But I would argue that right now, one of the major factors facing our country is a debt load that we cannot continue with over the long term. So if we cannot pass a piece of legislation like this, then I would say our opportunities of trying to curtail this debt is almost hopeless. So this bill is limited in scope and applies only to grants and other financial assistance under Section 103 of the Clean Air Act, which authorizes the administrator to undertake certain research, investigation, and training. Now, we know that their money has gone to the Chinese for swine study. We know money's gone to the Ukraine, has gone to Polish municipalities regarding landfill gas. We know it's gone to Indonesia. We know a lot of it's gone to the United Nations. And all of these projects may be perfectly fine, but when we have this kind of debt, we're simply trying to make a statement, let's curtail this for a period of time. And that's what this legislation is designed to do. And as we go through this hearing, we'll get more into the specifics of it. But I would reiterate once again, certainly not my purpose, not my intent to try to jump on the Obama administration for doing this. This is a government program that's gone on for too long. At this time, we think it should be halted. So that's what it's all about. And at this time, I yield to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I tell you, Mr. Chairman, in my 20 years in this Congress, I have never seen nor heard of anything that's so shallow, any legislation that appeared before any committee of the Congress that's so shallow, so ill-informed, so misplaced in this piece of legislation that we are wasting the taxpayers' money on right now by even considering this headline-grabbing attempt by your side to one more time cast the Obama administration in an unworthy light. Mr. Chairman, we've been having hearings, and it seems as though we are presiding again as one of the most ineffective and unproductive sessions of this subcommittee in recent years. And I think that I thought that maybe over the summer, especially when we're under a new decorum here, I thought that at least we will have a different kind of attitude as we start this after this summer recess. But Mr. Chairman, I want to remind you that it's been a year now, and the Republicans on this subcommittee have passed message vote after message vote. They brought up a barrage of useless bills expressing some kind of atavistic dislike over the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and again the Obama administration. And this bill, I must remind you or predict that it's headed straight to the legislative scrap pile, to the scrap heap, where all legislation like this usually winds up. And this bill is not aimed at producing not one job for the American people, or it's not aimed at moving our country's energy policy forward, not even one iota, one scintilla. Today we are having this hearing and trying to keep the EPA or banning the EPA from awarding grants or contracts or partnerships in foreign countries that could be used to address global issues, not just issues that where we're not affected by. These are global issues that most of this money goes toward. Issues like climate change. Mr. Chairman, climate change don't just affect your constituents in Kentucky or my constituents in Illinois. We're living in a global environment, and climate change affects all of us. Mercury emissions affect all of us. They don't have any kind of consideration for national borders. Mr. Chairman, again, we're trying to embarrass the administration, and we're going about this and absolutely wrong. There are some facts. You might not want to hear them, but there are some facts. You know, under the data has proven that provided by the EPA to this committee, to this subcommittee, shows that under President Obama, the EPA grants to have resulted in less spending abroad than in the last year of the Bush administration. Foreign expenditures covered by the EPA grants total $8.5 million in 2008 and declined to $6 million in 2011. Mr. Chairman, you might not want the American people to know, but I'm going to tell them that most of this money that's of these grants, they don't go outside of the shores of this nation. These grants, this money is spent right here at home in our universities, our research centers. All right, these grants help keep American people, American scientists, American students, keep them busy, keep them working. This is certainly not a boondoggle for some foreign government. Mr. Chairman, I think that we are really way off base with this. This would be laughable if it was not so serious in that we are wasting precious taxpayer dollars on this shallow, non-productive hearing on this bill that I guarantee you will not see the light of day. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, as we know, we're going to be discussing H.R. 4255, the Accountability and Grants Act of 2012, which prohibits EPA from awarding grants to foreign countries under the Clean Air Act. Over the past 18 months, this committee has held numerous hearings on various actions taken by the EPA, and one reoccurring theme throughout our oversight is that the agency has strayed away from its core mission. In fact, EPA is pursuing a wide-ranging agenda that is neither specified nor required under the Clean Air Act. One example is the agency's war on coal. EPA has no statutory authority to set America's energy policy, yet the agency has embarked on a multi-pronged agenda to regulate coal out of existence. We're going to continue to push back hard against this anti-coal effort to protect jobs and ensure Americans continue to have access to affordable electricity. But today, we're addressing another one of the agency's questionable activities, the sending of millions of dollars in grants overseas, particularly those grants awarded under Section 103 of the Clean Air Act. There is nothing in the Clean Air Act directing the EPA to send tax dollars abroad. And the American people would not be pleased to know that we're subsidizing foreign projects at a time when millions of Americans are out of work, and the national debt has now eclipsed $16 trillion. While the practice of awarding such grants to foreign recipients did not begin with this EPA, it is under this administration that foreign grant spending has nearly doubled. Agency doled out nearly $12 million in foreign grants in 2009, $22 million in 10, $28 million in 11. It's a disturbing trend that won't stop unless we do something about it. It's not merely an issue of money. In fact, many of these foreign grants raise questions for reasons that go well beyond the dollars and cents. Some of the grants go to countries like China, Russia, Brazil, who rank among the largest foreign holders of U.S. Treasury securities. In the case of China, we're talking about a country that holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. debt, so we have the odd situation of borrowing money from a country and then giving back some of it in grants. Several grants go to foreign countries to help their industries deal with various pollution issues, but many of these foreign energy producers and manufacturers are in direct competition with their American counterparts. The fact that the very same EPA that is strangling our domestic industry with regulatory red tape is also sending checks that assist foreign competitors raises questions as well. In addition, many of these grants seem downright outlandish. $450,000 for the Breathe Easy Jakarta initiative? Somehow this spending has got to come to an end. The Accountability and Grants Act would prohibit any more American tax dollars from being used under Section 103 of the Clean Air Act for purposes outside of the U.S. In doing so, the bill will save taxpayer dollars and force the administration to focus on actual responsibilities here at home, and I yield back to Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Chairman Upton, and thank you, Chairman Whitfield, for scheduling a legislative hearing on H.R. 4255. During the EPA budget hearing back last spring, we asked a number of questions which were related to how the EPA was spending taxpayer monies at what would appear to be breakneck speeds. The economy is still struggling, although it is somewhat better. This Congress is facing some of the most difficult spending decisions in our history. As we all know, very soon we're going to have to take up a bill to determine whether we want to allow the sequester to go forward, if we want to change it in some way. The Clean Air Act does allow EPA to issue grants to projects both here in the United States and around the world. Subcommittee staff have discovered that over 300 grants have been given to projects around the world in the last number of years. Since 2009, for example, we had almost $1 million that was given to China to study air pollution in that country, $200,000 to study something called clean cooking in Ethiopia. $300,000 went towards methane recovery in Ecuador, just for example. We even sent almost $8 million for something called technical assistance in Russia. Several million dollars have gone to groups, international groups, such as United Nations. It's no wonder that the EPA's budget has gone up almost 35% or 34% during the Obama administration and is now over $10 billion per year. I don't believe, Mr. Chairman, that this type of spending reflects the priorities of the average American voter that vote for us to come to Washington. I just finished almost a dozen town hall meetings in my district down in Texas during August Not once did I have a constituent stand up and tell me to spend more money for EPA grants overseas. So I'm very glad, Mr. Chairman, that you put this bill forward, and I hope on a bipartisan basis we can move it very expeditiously to full committee and then to the floor. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note that the committee Republicans launched an investigation into EPA's long-standing practice of awarding grants for work abroad. This investigation was commenced last summer, and the Republicans released a staff report saying that President Obama had doled out millions of dollars to foreign recipients. But this report was seriously flawed. Half of the grants they criticized President Obama for awarding actually started under the George W. Bush administration. So I wrote to Chairman Upton and Chairman Whitfield and explained that their report was incorrect. I asked them to retract that report until they reviewed the facts more carefully. So what do? They ignored the letter, just as they've ignored a lot of letters. EPA then provided the committee with a comprehensive list of 500 grants awarded in the last 10 years for projects with an international component. Republicans have used this data to argue the Obama administration has increased grant funding for foreign projects. In fact, almost half of these grants went to U.S.-based university organizations, not foreign recipients, and many had only the most minor international connection. EPA calls a grant international if the grantee spends any money abroad at all, even if it's just to fly to a conference in a different country to get the perspectives of international experts. One grant on the list went to the University of Pittsburgh for research into air pollution in New York City. EPA Administrator Jackson explained this to the committee last February. She testified that very little of the money categorized as international actually went abroad. Well, after that hearing, we sent another letter to Chairman Whitfield raising concerns about how the committee Republicans were portraying EPA's international grant-making activities. Again, we didn't get a response. So we decided to ask EPA to tell us how much money the grantees actually spent abroad. And based on that data, we found that EPA grantees have spent less abroad on average under the Obama administration than they did during the last year of the Bush administration. And I'd like to introduce into the record a supplemental memo that explains the reality of EPA's international grants program. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, without objection, we can take that into the record. This hearing and the bill we're considering are a good illustration of what's wrong with this committee. Facts don't seem to matter. This bill proves that poor oversight leads to dumb legislation. There's another problem with this bill. Its entire premise is that the U.S. engagement with the rest of the world on environmental issues is wrong. We don't have enough money to send to those foreigners. That's the line we're hearing from the other side of the aisle. Well, the United States does not exist in a bubble. Pollution doesn't respect national borders. Pollution does not need a passport. That's why sustained U.S. international engagement by EPA and other federal agencies is essential. When we wanted EPA to crack down on U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases, the Republicans said it wouldn't do any good. We need an international response. Unilateral climate change would harm U.S. competitiveness. They say they want an international solution. But when EPA makes a grant to build global support for reducing emissions of methane or black carbon, which contribute to climate change, the same members attack EPA for spending U.S. funds abroad. It's a cynical catch-22. Committee Republicans ridicule Breathe Easy Jakarta, this is their press release, for its name, but ignore that this modest $15,000 will help the Indonesian city transition away from leaded gasoline. They ignore the benefit of providing funding for cleaner cook stoves so that poor women and children in Haiti and other developing countries aren't exposed to deadly indoor air pollution. Well, no one at Mr. Barton's town hall meeting said they wanted it, but if they knew about it, I would think they support it. We want to protect kids in other countries and help other countries protect their population from air pollution that causes mental retardation. One of our greatest strengths as Americans is our generosity to those in need. Sadly, we seem to regard compassion to the needy as a weakness, not a virtue on this committee. And I want to add, even though my time has expired, that painting this room green does not make this committee green. And I otherwise will privately tell the chairman how ugly I think the walls are, but I don't want to say that publicly. Yield back my time.
I didn't have anything to do with the color of these walls. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for your opening statement. Mr. Hooks, we genuinely appreciate your being with us this morning, and I'm reluctant to say that not infrequently we have to delay hearings for one reason or the other. And today we are having a memorial service for the 9/11 victims in the Capitol that begins in a few minutes. So we're going to recess this hearing until 11:30, and I hope that's not too much of an inconvenience for you, but we do look forward to your testimony, and we'll recess the hearing then until 11:30, and I know we have other witnesses after that, and I hope that you all will bear with us, and because we do look forward to your testimony, and we'll reconvene at 11:30. So this time the hearing's recessed. Mr. Hooks, we'll get started as soon as our friends on this side show up. Okay, Mr. Hooks, thank you very much for being with us this morning, and we look forward to your testimony, and I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement, and then at the end of that time, we'll have questions for you. And Mr. Rush is here, but he's in the ante room. He'll be right in, but in the meantime, we'd like for you to go on and get started.
Great, thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 4255. This bill would prohibit the EPA from awarding grants under the Clean Air Act, Section 103, for any program, project, or activity outside of the United States. Since 1972, administrations of both parties have used international grants awarded by EPA to support public health and environmental protection globally. These grants comprise a very small percentage of EPA's grant budget and are supported in part with appropriations from other agencies. Most of this money is spent here in the United States. In fact, from fiscal year 2008 through 2010, about 2/3 of the total awarded through grants designated as international was allocated for work here in the United States. While EPA's investment in international grants is small, these grants support efforts to reduce transboundary and global environmental threats to the United States, reducing the cost and increasing the effectiveness of the nation's environmental protection. They also serve broader U.S. foreign policy and economic interests. Section 103 grants are a key component of EPA's international grant portfolio. Among the programs supported with Section 103 grants that would be adversely impacted by H.R. 4255 are the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air, or PCIA, and the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles. These programs were launched by the Bush administration in 2002. The PCIA addresses the burning of solid fuels for household cooking and heating. Over half of the world's population uses these fuels, which cause indoor air pollution, resulting in premature deaths of more than 2 million people annually. The PCFV reduces air pollution in developing and transitional countries by promoting the use of lead-free and low-sulfur fuels and clean vehicles. These programs have produced outstanding results. The PCIA, through EPA grants and other activities, has enabled at least 9.3 million households to adopt cleaner technologies and fuels, improving the health and livelihood of 52.4 million people in developing countries. Similarly, the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles has contributed to more than 180 countries eliminating lead from fuels and opened international markets to American manufacturers of advanced air pollution control equipment. This legislation would also inhibit EPA's ability to address overseas emissions of toxic mercury pollution. Where mercury deposition is highest in the United States, domestic sources are the largest contributors. However, mercury in the atmosphere can be transported globally. In much of the U.S., mercury from global sources dominates deposition. Furthermore, much of the marine fish that Americans consume comes from waters far from our shores. Therefore, to fully protect Americans from toxic effects of mercury contamination, a global effort is required. EPA has provided funding under Section 103 to the United Nations Environmental Program to support efforts to reduce mercury use in products and manufacturing processes, as well as mercury emissions in the atmosphere from a variety of sources. H.R. 4255 would also adversely impact the Global Methane Initiative, or GMI, a program initiated under the Bush administration to reduce methane emissions. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas and contributes to the formation of tropospheric ozone, an air pollutant that is transported across borders and causes significant health problems in the U.S. and around the world. Under the GMI, EPA's Section 103 grants support work with 41 countries, international financial institutions, and hundreds of private sector organizations to reduce methane emissions. GMI grants have directly provided over $2.7 million in benefits to U.S. companies, universities, and nonprofit organizations. These grants have created significant market opportunities for U.S. technologies, goods, and services. In total, U.S. support for GMI has leveraged more than $398 million in additional investment in methane-reducing projects around the globe. Countries need adequate governmental structures to enforce environmental standards. This can benefit U.S. companies by helping to ensure that foreign companies are subject to similar regulatory requirements. H.R. 4255 would hinder our ability to promote strong governance through continued award of Section 103 grants that assist U.S. trading partners in developing effective institutions. Finally, H.R. 4255 would inhibit international scientific collaboration that strengthens the quality of EPA-supported research by prohibiting travel of Section 103 grant-funded scientists to attend international meetings or work with scientists at foreign institutions. Such a limitation would conflict with well-established international collaboration practices of federal science agencies. Section 103 grants play an important role in improving the quality of the U.S. and the world environment, providing business opportunities for U.S. companies and supporting U.S. foreign policy interests. The EPA believes that H.R. 42 would cripple the agency's ability through grants to address harmful air pollutants that affect both the global and domestic environment. Thank you for inviting me here today, and I'm ready, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Hooks, very much. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and then we'll give other members an opportunity. Has the EPA taken a formal position on opposing or supporting the legislation? I know you said it would cripple the agency, so I'm assuming you're not going to support it, but are you all, have you adopted a formal position of opposition to it?
We've not adopted a formal opposition to this proposed legislation, no, sir.
Okay. Now, these 103 grants have certainly been in the Clean Air Act for many years, and as of the end of last year, at least from the information I was able to obtain from EPA, there was not any formal agenda or procedure for determining how these grants would be made. Do you all have a formal procedure adopted at EPA on how the decision will be made on these grants?
The majority of our grants are actually awarded competitively. There are international entities have the ability to compete for certain grants. In these instances, they were awarded through a competitive process.
Okay. The reason I was asking the question, we'd received recently a grants policy issuance, GPI 1204, Award Administration of Foreign Grants, and I was just wondering, is this an official document of EPA, and is this, do you know what I'm talking about, or have you seen it? Or?
Yes, I do. We periodically actually review our internal grant policies and create additional guidance as necessary to ensure consistent management of our assistance agreements for all types of award recipients. Separate and apart from the subcommittee's investigation, we had already identified updating our awards to foreign entities as a priority for this fiscal year.
Okay. Now, when we've looked at Section 103 of the Clean Air Act, and you read that in its entirety, there's not any mention whatsoever of any grant for international purposes. So what is the legal authority of EPA for making these grants?
We actually believe there's a couple of authorities that provide our ability to award these grants. We use Section 103A and Section 103B, but in addition to that, we actually refer to Section 102F of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act.
So you do rely on 103A and 103B as well?
Correct.
What specific language?
Well, maybe specific language by omission as opposed to directly. It does not state directly international entities. However, It does say that it directs EPA to establish national research and development program, including training activities related to the prevention and control of air pollution.
Yeah.
Given the transboundary and international nature of air pollution, we think it provides us the authority to deal with air pollution issues at its source as well.
Do you need the NEPA authority then? If you have 103 A and B, do you need NEPA authority?
It is just an additional authority that we use in this instance.
Okay, so it's under NEPA then there are various federal agencies that have the authority, at least that's your all's position, to make these international grants?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. In order for any of the above statutes to apply internationally, they must be supplemented by NEPA 102A, okay, 102 2F, all right. Now, where's that executive order that we were looking at a while ago? You know, as I said in my opening statement, you know, one of the concerns that we have is not that the Obama administration is doing any more than anyone else, although the total amount of grants from 2008 through 2011 is 78 million, and in 2011 it was over 28 million, and 2010 over 22 million. And I know not all of that has been identified as specifically for international, but as we're dealing with this debt, the reason we're focusing on this is that, you know, I think it's helpful, I think it's healthy to look at these agencies and they're spending, for example, China alone through this program has received over $3 or $4 million over the last 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And as you know, we're borrowing a lot of money from China to turn around and give them money back. So my time has expired, but at this time I recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Hooks. Let's talk about China and the Obama administration in terms of the president sending checks to China. Can you tell me, for the record, is the majority of the funds from the international grants remain inside the U.S. or most of the money sent overseas?
Right. The majority of our international grants, as they've been defined, are spent here in the United States.
By whom and for what?
Principally through private industry. It can also go to universities and nonprofits. The majority go to universities and nonprofits.
For what?
To do a variety of things. Through a variety of very outstanding programs. The Global Methane Initiative, which was launched back in 2004, is designed to reduce the amount of methane in our environment. The Clean Fuels and Vehicles Program, designed to reduce leaded gasoline and low sulfur fuels, and Partnership for Clean Air, clean indoor air, is designed to reduce the amount of exposure to wood stoves.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any other nations having a similar international obligation or meet the international needs as it relates to pollution? Any other nation that sends money similar to what we do?
Sure. I think that's been one of the beauties about these programs is the international component associated with them. Mm-hmm. Right now there are 41 countries that participate in the Global Methane Initiative. I think there are over 115 countries that are participating with the Clean Indoor Air Initiative, and I'm not sure exactly how many countries are participating with the Clean Fuels and Vehicles Program, but it's an international group of countries that are now participating, and based large in part on the U.S.'s leadership.
And if this bill were to pass, which I doubt very seriously, but if by some chance it passed the Senate, goes to the president's desk, he signs it, what would the impact of this bill becoming a law? What would the impact of that being in terms of our international stature, particularly as it relates to pollution?
Well, EPA is certainly viewed as the international leader in terms of government entities. So the rest of the world does turn to the EPA for its leadership and advice and counsel. I think if this legislation were to pass, clearly we would not be able to participate in programs such as these. But I think it would also have a very chilling effect in terms of our research, in terms of the research that we conduct. It would prohibit a university professor, if you will, going to Canada to participate in an international meeting. And much of the international work and scientific and technical work that we do is based in large part based on an international an effort in putting the best minds and putting the best science towards our environmental decision making.
Okay, what is the total percentage of EPA funds that are allocated to this program?
For our international grant activities, it's less than 1%
Less than 1%.
of our EPA budget.
So, but because we spend that less than 1%, then we have credibility in terms of the voice of the American people being heard and felt as it relates to global issues around the environment, in this instance, pollution, air pollution. Is that correct?
That would definitely be correct. Again, like I said earlier, the rest of the country does look to EPA for its leadership, not only in our ability to promote capacity building and governance, but also they look to the United States government for our technology as well. When we have the ability to go into these foreign countries, impart our knowledge, we actually can bring our technologies with us. For example, when the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles, the fact that most of the continent of Africa is no longer using leaded fuel or is on target to no longer use leaded fuel, that enables our emission control technology to come into play. Catalytic converters is a good would be a perfect.
Well, I only have one more second. Let me say, I just kind of believe that if this bill passed, it kind of reminds me of a gag rag that we're tying around, we're muffling or gagging the voice of the American people as it relates to the environment, our environmental leadership, and our strong voice that's been here present for the world. We lead the world in terms of environmental issues and matters. We're going to tie a gag rag around that voice, silence that voice as it relates to the American people if this bill passes. So thank you so very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my mind started racing during this colloquy with Mr. Rush. In your conclusion, in your statement, you said that this bill would cripple, quote unquote, the agency's ability through grants to address harmful air pollutants that affect both global and domestic environment. And in your colloquy here, you had mentioned also that this is about, well, it's less than 1% of the budget. It seems like an extreme exaggeration then to reach a conclusion if 1% of the EPA's budget was eliminated, that would equal 100% of all new technologies and research, like the catalytic converter. So was the catalytic converter a result of foreign grants?
No, that was a result of the
See, that's my point. I think you in this colloquy, you were leaving us with the impression that purposely that there would be no new technologies, and I think that's so much of an exaggeration that it probably impacted your credibility. But I wanted to talk about how much of that 1% is going to the UN. As I understand, some of that money is going to the United Nations Environmental Program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have the amount?
I don't have that with me.
All
but
right.
you haven't read it.
But in general, then, could you tell me, once we provide those funds to UNEP, do we have any control over where those dollars go? Or-
In the award of these grants, we actually manage and track these grants the same way that we would a grant here in the United States. They would be subject to the same pre-award processing and requirements in terms of reporting that our local our U.S. entities, if they were to
So
receive
you,
the grant.
you're sure that UNEP is then providing you with the documentation to show how those dollars are being used once the grant has been issued to UNEP?
Yeah, it's part of one of the requirements is that grantees supply us
Okay.
with.
So those
reports.
documents would be easy. Could you provide those to the committee? Because I'd like to see how they're actually using those dollars and how we're tracking those.
Yes, sir.
So that's. Do you know offhand though? I'm really kind of confused. As I understand, the dollars just go to UNEP, and then the grant's issued. But how do you follow up? I mean, they just then after that UNEP sends you the documents, probably outlined in the grant.
It's going to be. Well, I'd have to actually get back to you specifically on
Okay,
how.
if you would
exactly how
do
those-
that.
I can do that.
All right. All right. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thanks, Mr. Terry. This time I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up just a little bit more on that question. Maybe I make sure I heard correctly that when grants and others are given to the countries, universities, wherever, I'm curious about the follow-up. Particularly, there were several that, well, let's take some of the more serious ones was the demonstration project for the abatement of nitric oxide emissions using, anyway, it's a demonstration project. What did we do? Did we follow up?
Yeah, what particular?
This was with Taiwan, funded in '02. I'm just curious, do we have a set pattern of following up to see that once money's been given to something, do we have a procedure to see what they've done with it?
Once EPA makes an international grant award, we carefully monitor the grant. This includes administrative and programmatic post-award monitoring as well.
But what happens afterwards? If we do a pilot project that ends in a couple of years, whatever, do we follow back up again to see, was this just a one-shot deal, or do we make that a condition? No, listen, is that a condition of the grant that they're going to continue to fund this project?
No, sir.
Okay, so things like there are a series of them like that we're giving money away and we're not following up a pilot project and clean projects and processes in Norway, a diesel retrofit demonstration project in Thailand. Did we follow up to find out, are they continuing to work with diesel fuels in that country, or is this just a one-shot deal?
I don't know specifically about the particular projects you might be referencing to, but I can tell you in terms of scientific growth, you know, we learn from these projects. One of the great benefits in terms of what we might be piloting or demonstrating in a particular country is that we have the ability to take the lessons learned and transfer that to other regions.
But when we fund these other projects, if they just die on the vine, if they're just one-shot deal, I'm just curious, what American project that maybe could have put some people to work here in research or something in America, but lost out in the competitive research, and I look at this one that we did a field survey of endangered whale population offshore of Russia. What American project lost out to that?
Well, I'm not sure if that's a Clean Air Act.
Clean Air Act has to do with whales?
I'm not sure if that's a Clean Air Act. There are other authorities.
No, this is
besides
your
the Clean
list
Air Act.
that you all provided. I'm just curious about that, but obviously you don't have the answer for
Well,
that.
I believe that we supplied the committee all of our international grants, regardless of the authority.
I'm just curious, with all this money we're spending overseas, and whether it's $30 million or $5 million, when the EPA itself recognizes that the biggest detriment to healthcare in America is indoor air quality. In its own website, the EPA publishes that it's 96 times worse indoors than outdoors. But yet we're spending money on things. I don't know what we're doing in America to focus on indoor air quality. I don't see much at all on that. And that's the issue that we know when we have the asthma attacks, we have other issues that are talking about where is it in America? Why aren't we educating our American people on where our air quality issues are rather than worrying about the endangered whales off Russia?
Well, as it relates to air quality, air pollution is an international problem. It's been fairly well documented that certainly pollution from Asia is deposited here in this country. The same as pollution that's generated here in this country goes across the Atlantic and gets deposited in Europe. International air pollution problems is an international
Not denying that, but I'm just saying at this time when we can't afford it, I think I'd rather spend my money taking care of American citizens and educating American folks about indoor air quality or whatever it is than worrying about some of these others. So what I'm hearing, wrapping up, we don't have necessarily, or you're not aware of, a follow-up program to find out after we do a demonstration project, after we do a startup, there is no follow-up to see that they continue with that. We don't have a prioritization of where we're going to spend money on indoor air quality in America, but we're sure spending a lot of money dealing with the indoor air quality overseas. And lastly is that apparently we're losing out. Some of our American companies are losing out in applications for this to foreign governments. I'd be curious how many American applications were lost in the shuffle.
Well, Jim, to go back to one of the advantages of these grants is actually creating market opportunities for U.S. industry here in this country. The Global Methane Initiative, while the EPA component, it's a multiple agency component, by the way. In fact, the majority of the money that has been distributed through the Section 103 grants has actually not come from EPA. It's actually come from the Department of State and USAID and other agencies as well. For example, I know that Caterpillar was able to sell 62 megawatt generators to a coal mine in China for $100 million. Megtech, which is another large subsidiary, U.S. subsidiary here in this country, was able to sell some thermal oxidizers for millions of dollars as well overseas to overseas countries. It's this kind of, putting our foothold into these countries that actually is good for U.S. industry as well. But conversely, as I said it before, air pollution does not respect geopolitical boundaries. I think that was maybe stated in one of the opening statements. Does not respect geopolitical boundaries. So U.S. monies that can be spent at the source of pollution, I think is a good use of our money because ultimately that deposition can impact our U.S. shores.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Crooks, I might just make one comment here. You were talking about Caterpillar selling equipment to coal mines in China. As a result of EPA, we can't even build a new coal-fired plant in America. So it's nice that you all like to see equipment going to China so they can mine coal. Recognize the gentleman, Mr. Pompeo from Kansas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on that. We've had multiple hearings on energy initiatives here in America, and it's great to see you talk about how pollution from Asia impacts us here. I will tell you that the very policies that the Environmental Protection Agency has put in place has driven that production, coal-fired power plants, all of those things out of America, all of this manufacturing out of America, and then the pollution comes back. Actually, in the very first hearing as a member of Congress, I asked Ms. Jackson about that, and she poo-pooed the idea that this pollution was coming here and that they don't live under the same regulatory environment that we do and don't have the same rules for their processes. So it's fascinating to hear you sort of argue the other side of the coin inside the administration. I'd suggest maybe a little meeting between the two of you. But I want to get to a couple things that you said. Do the grants for international, or do the competition for international grants compete with the domestic grants?
Yes.
They're in the same pool?
Yes, sir.
And what part of that is the fact that it's not in the United States? That is, how much of a piece of the criteria is the fact that it's a non-U.S. applicant versus a U.S. applicant? What piece of the criteria is that?
Can you restate the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so they're in the same pool competing for the same grant money, American taxpayer money, and when you're deciding whether to send it to Kentucky or Botswana, how much of the fact that it's not in America does that impact your decision-making process?
Well, bear in mind, the majority of our international grant money would go to would go like to the University of Kentucky, where a Kentucky professor or graduate.
The majority, those that don't. Let's
would
talk about
do.
those that don't go to a U.S. institution. Is it a factor that it's a non-U.S. entity? Is that weighed in the merit process, or is it blind? You don't even know if it's going to Oregon or Denmark.
Well, we would know where the grant proposal, where the monies were.
So do you
where
use
the
it as a
funding
factor in the
formed.
decision-making process?
Well, ultimately, one of the criteria that we're going to use is how does it impact the human health and the environment here in the United States.
So it doesn't matter what
there are other
country.
criteria.
So it doesn't matter the country that it's going to. If it's got a higher net benefit on an environmental basis, then it goes to Denmark as opposed to Oregon. You don't weigh the fact that it's a non-U.S. entity directly.
The first criteria that we're going to use is the impact and the
Right.
benefit to the environmental quality of the United
Makes
States.
sense. You talked about sort of nation building and national security. Do you coordinate with the State Department before making these grant awards?
Yes, we do.
And the Department of Defense?
Not the Department of Defense.
So just the State Department.
Yes, sir.
Got it. How many offices within EPA actually distribute grants for activities that occur overseas other than under this particular program?
I don't know specifically, but certainly our Office of Research and Development, obviously the AIR program. But I'd have to check.
Are they coordinated? That is, are you all saying, you know, the State Department says we don't really want to deal with this nation. I think we won't give them a grant. Are you guys coordinated, or is it completely stovepiped so you all don't know what's going on in the other parts of EPA, let alone other parts of the administration?
No, it is coordinated. Before we award a grant, it would be coordinated with our Office of International and Tribal Affairs. Once it meets their criteria, it would be sent to the State Department, provided it met their criteria, provided that they concurred, we would fund it. If either one of those entities were to non-concur, if it was inconsistent with our foreign policy, then it would not be funded.
Great. I'll close here. I have to tell you that when I go home, much like you heard before, I go home and talk to folks, to justify, when you're $16 trillion in the hole, to justify programs like this is an incredibly difficult sell. It's not something that I can support. You all talk about it being bipartisan. This began in previous administration. That may well be. I'm neutral as to who's making this poor decision, whether it's a Democrat or Republican administration, is of no importance to me. This is a program whose time, if it was ever here, is certainly gone now, and I yield back the balance of my time.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Hooks. You would agree with me that Virginia is more important than Kazakhstan, would you not?
I would agree that
at least to our government.
To our government, yeah.
All right. And you would also agree, would you not, that China is not doing enough to clean up their air pollution, and that you would like to see them moving at a faster pace? Is that not correct?
That would be correct.
So then I question why you would not, or why the EPA would not support withholding money from any country that's not moving fast enough or as fast as the United States at cleaning up its air pollution, because I note that in a Virginian Pilot article of yesterday that the EPA, in regard to the Chesapeake Bay, has held back Virginia's money, 1.2 of the $2.4 million granted originally to Virginia to help it clean up the bay. And I understand I'm talking about water, but I was glad to hear that you all are coordinated. So I want you to take this message back, that you all are withholding that money because you don't think Virginia's moving fast enough on stormwater management. And one of the problems that Virginia's having with that, of course, is that the cities that are required to do more on stormwater management of the waters that fall in their streets are Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, Newport News, and Hampton. And while I don't represent those areas, I certainly feel their pain. And they say that it would be expensive, and that they're having a hard time coming up with the money because they've thrown up their hands. As I'm quoting from the article now, local governments across Virginia have thrown up their hands at the prospect of financing stormwater upgrades amid budget crises and layoffs. And yet we're sending money to other countries, but we're holding back the money to Virginia. And I hope, and I'm not going to ask you for a response because I know it puts you at odds, and the water side of it's not your deal, but I hope that somebody at the EPA recognizes the
the conflict there. We're going to hold back Virginia's money. We're going to make it even harder on localities that are struggling now to deal with stormwater management. At the same time, we're sending money to places like China, Kazakhstan, and there's a lot of different places that we've sent money to. And it just seems when we're having issues with money in this country that maybe we ought to care more about the Bay than we do necessarily what's going on in some small project in China. Moving on, I will also note that I agreed with and hear the chairman's comments in regard to coal mining. We lost another 620 miners last week who were laid off in my district in one small town alone, and yet I noticed that one of, and it's true that some of these were started in the previous administration, so I'm not trying to pick on the administration, but explaining why I think this bill has some merit and why we should take a look at it. We're helping the Chinese figure out how to, it's technical assessment of coal mine gas recovery and utilization in China. Well, the Chinese don't seem to be having any problem competing with us on all kinds of different levels, and I don't understand why we're giving them grants to help them in their industries. Now, can you explain that to me?
Well, one of the purposes of the grant is actually for governance and capacity building. One of the things that we're trying to do in these foreign countries as they approach us for our advice and expertise is how do they raise the environmental standards that we have here in this country? If we are successful at what we're doing, if we can raise the environmental standards and environmental requirements and the governance of other countries, that puts our U.S. industry at a more equal footing in terms of our ability to compete.
And I'm wondering, that was $180,000, and I'm wondering if you all have given any mining operations in the United States $180,000 to help them with technical assessment of coal mine gas recovery and utilization. Because what my companies tell me generally is that you all come in and tell them they got to do it, they have to spend the money, or they get fined. So it looks like to me we're taking money out of the mines, out of the pockets of the mines in the United States, while we're giving money to help the Chinese mines figure out their problems.
Well, I think, Bill, bear in mind our mission. We actually
let me ask this question because my time is running out.
Okay.
Have you given any $180,000 grants to United States mines to help them with this same type of thing?
We work extensively with the U.S. Mining Commission on voluntary programs such as coal mine methane reduction. We understand it can be used as an energy source, and it's also
It's
also very explosive.
I'll use Mr. Dingell's comment. Yes or no?
Well.
Have you given any grants of a similar size, $180,000 or more, to U.S. mining concerns in regard to helping them mine coal?
I do not know. I'm not saying that we haven't. I'm just not aware of any personally.
All right. You don't have a list of those. Can you get me a list of all of those?
Of where we worked with the U.S. mining industry?
Where you've given grant money to help U.S. coal mines figure out better ways to give them money to help them put the equipment in or whatever's necessary, like you did the Chinese.
Okay.
And I'm looking at page 17 of your report. Technical assessment of coal mine gas recovery and utilization.
I'll see what we have in our files.
And like some of the others have said, I am glad that you recognize it's an international problem. One of our concerns has been that we think we're sending jobs with so many different regulations coming from so many different parts of the EPA and other agencies at one time that we're actually sending a lot of jobs overseas. And as you recognize, we're reaping back pollution. And we think we need a better paced set of regulations and more reasonable regulations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Truix, I want to thank you very much for being with us this morning. In concluding, we would appreciate if you would get back to the committee with a list of grants that have been made to U.S. coal mining companies.
Bear in mind, some of our grants go to universities, and they in turn, or other institutions, and they in turn work with other entities.
No, but we'd like a list of any direct grants you've given to coal mining companies.
Yeah, we wouldn't have the authority to actually to give a grant to a mining company.
Okay, then I would like for you to do this. I want to give you a grant number. Grant number 832-99401. 832-99401 and 835-05-801. 835-05-801. Those were two grants that the EPA through 103 grants gave to the China Coal Information Institute, and I would like for you to provide the committee a synopsis of the information or benefit to the taxpayers from those 2 grants. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes the questions. Mr. Hooks, thank you again for being with us. And at this time, I'd like to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you have a question? No. Okay. This time, I'd like to call up those on panel 2, our witnesses on the second panel. And we have with us Mr. Daniel Simmons, who's the Director of Regulatory and State Affairs for the Institute for Energy Research. We have Dr. Andrew Light, Senior Fellow, Center for American Progress Action Fund, Associate Director, Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. We have Ms. Eliza Derby, Senior Program Officer, Windrock International, a coordinator for the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air. And we have Dr. David Kreutzer, Research Fellow in Energy Economics and Climate Change at the Heritage Foundation. So I'd like to welcome all 4 of you to the committee. We appreciate very much your taking time to join us to discuss H.R. 4255 and your views on the legislation. And Mr. Simmons, we'd like to start with you, and you'll recognize for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
My name is Daniel Simmons. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Institute for Energy Research. It is difficult for me to see the value of EPA providing taxpayer-funded grants to organizations and governments outside the United States for things such as good governance capacity building in Jordan or regulatory dialogue on landfill gas in Brazil. Part of the reason the United States is now over $16 trillion in debt is because the federal government has little spending discipline. Compared to $16 trillion, these grants are small, but the grants are systematic of out-of-control spending by the federal government. When individuals have money and debt problems, the common sense solution is to cut back on unnecessary spending. It is only fair to ask the federal government to do the same. Taxpayer dollars should be spent on projects that have an obvious benefit to the American people, and these foreign grants do little, if anything, to benefit Americans. If EPA would like to improve environmental quality at home and abroad, a far more productive approach would be to promote environmental improvements through economic growth. Years of research shows that economic growth promotes environmental protection. As noted previously, Section 103 does not provide explicit authority for EPA to award these grants to foreign entities, only to establish a national research and development program. But Section 103 also does not provide an explicit limitation, and therefore EPA for years has been awarding these sorts of grants. When faced with these questions, I would hope that EPA would look to the federal regulatory philosophy that is laid out in Executive Order 12866, which was originally signed by the Clinton administration and reaffirmed by the Bush administration, and again reaffirmed by the Obama administration. And in pertinent part, the executive order says that federal agencies should only promote, federal agencies should promulgate only such regulations as are required by law or necessary to interpret the law or made necessary by compelling public need. And it is difficult to see for these grants that they are required by law or necessary or what the compelling public need is, at least for American citizens. And these grants there is a large number of them that are definitely of dubious value for Americans. For example, on March 22nd of this year, EPA awarded a grant with the following description. The goal of this project is to increase environmental public participation through a pilot project in Dominican Republic. Alianza will work with stakeholders and appropriate governmental authorities to ensure the pilot project expected results are successfully accomplished. Now, I have no idea what in the world it means to increase environmental public participation and what value that is for the American people. Pollution may cross, may cross boundaries, but this isn't about that. This is about, quote, increasing environmental public participation. And if EPA wants to promote environmental protection, economic growth is a far better alternative. But as we've seen from EPA, a number of the regulations they've been promoting lately does not promote environmental does not provide environmental growth, does not promote economic growth. One example is the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule. The point of this rule, allegedly, is to reduce mercury. However, the rule costs $10 billion a year, according to EPA, and results in a maximum, according to EPA, of $6 billion in benefits from the reduction of mercury. In other words, this is a net cost to the American economy and, honestly, the economy of the world of $10 billion a year. You can buy a lot of anaerobic digesters in China or Brazil or where have you with $10 billion. And the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards is just one example, but it is representative of EPA's current regulatory philosophy. Far more benefits could be achieved, both environmental and economic, if EPA were more circumspect in its regulation. The American people want Congress to balance the budget and get America's fiscal house in order. One key to doing this is to reduce spending on things that are obviously unnecessary. It's not obvious what the value is to the American people of international grants issued under the Clean Air Act, Section 103. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons. And Dr. Light, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Whitfield, Representative Rush, honored members, I appreciate the invitation to testify on H.R. 4255. In these brief remarks, I will focus on that part of my written testimony which offers evidence for how Section 103 grants to foreign partners help to protect the health of Americans, fulfill our foreign policy objectives, ensure American competitiveness, and deliver on our ability to solve global environmental problems. I will give examples for each point, though my written testimony has many others. Point one, these grants help to protect the health and safety of Americans. Mr. Simmons called into question the utility of these grants for Americans. In fact, funding for studies and projects abroad directly help to protect us. For example, an interdisciplinary team led by Susan Annenberg at the University of North Carolina demonstrated in 2009 that reductions in air pollution in other countries will result in significantly reduced mortality rates here in the United States. Looking at the impacts of ozone pollution alone in their study, a target of many of these grants, they estimate foreign emission reductions contribute about 30% of the total avoided mortalities in North America, with almost 3/4 of those in the United States. Increasing these measures abroad will save more American lives. Point two, these grants help the United States to meet critical foreign policy objectives. In a moment, Ms. Durba will describe the importance of Winrock's work with the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air and the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, including the life-saving benefits these projects have provided for millions of people. But the Clean Cook Stoves initiative does more than prevent indoor air pollution. It reduces the vulnerability of women in African conflict zones by decreasing their time gathering fuel, which in turn increases their social mobility. This may not seem like much, but it's actually quite a lot for them, given their daily lives. More is provided here than a new appliance. These cook stoves assist in creating a fundamental element of democracy, namely a safe, free environment where they can have a chance at success, which in turn strengthens our relationship with these countries. Point three, these grants help to ensure competitiveness for American companies, as many have already argued. Support for multilateral organizations that raise ambition for tighter pollution protection measures abroad, including cooperation with organizations like UNEP, the OECD, and others, help to ensure that developing countries are applying similar pollution standards that we do at home. Programs like the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles, as we heard in the first panel, help U.S. companies abroad because equal regulation on air pollution creates a level playing field for American companies to be competitive when manufacturers in other countries are being held to the same standards. Point four, these grants are critical for applying global solutions to global challenges, and I'll spend a bit more time on this one. The Global Methane Initiative, mentioned earlier by Assistant Administrator Hooks, certainly helps to reduce the impact of this powerful greenhouse gas, as he said. But the impacts go much further and help to explain why all countries have an interest in cooperatively taking on these challenges and are doing so now. Methane, along with black carbon, hydrofluorocarbons, and tropospheric ozone, are what we call short-lived climate pollutants. Not only do these gases have more warming potential than carbon dioxide, some of them are potentially deadly. Each year, millions of people die prematurely from black carbon or soot. These gases are also responsible for extensive crop losses each year. Regardless of one's views on the reality of climate change, we don't have to agree on that. Addressing these non-CO2 pollutants is both cost-effective and yields multiple health and economic benefits. For example, this year, a study published in Science by an international team led by NASA's Drew Shendell estimated the effects of 14 very straightforward methane and black carbon control measures. Implementation of these measures would avoid up to 4.7 million annual premature deaths worldwide and increase crop yields annually by 30 to 135 million metric tons starting in 2030 and beyond, including 6.3 proven million tons of crops in the United States. The costs for these programs are minimal. Reducing a metric ton of methane costs around $250, while the benefit ranges from $700 to $5,000. Already, U.S. investments in the Global Methane Initiative have leveraged $398 million in additional investment, or almost 3 times as much as all 103 grants to foreign recipients since the year 2000. Developing countries simply cannot leverage private finance in the way that U.S. dollars can, and that is why we need cooperation on these efforts moving forward. Now, for those who are concerned with global warming, this suite of measures reduces total projected warming by ½ degree Celsius. Given that the current internationally accepted goal is to try to stabilize temperature increase caused by humans at 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, and given that humans have already pushed the temperature up almost 1 degree, we can't afford not to do this. The measures studied in the Schindel paper include reducing methane leakage from coal mining, oil and gas production, landfills, wastewater, livestock manure, and rice paddies. The black carbon measures cover diesel vehicles, clean burning biomass, and things like cook stoves. In other words, exactly the same kinds of programs that the Section 103 grants are funding right now. Provision of these funds is not proof that developing countries will not work towards reducing emissions on their own, as some have argued. Instead, it shows that an ambitious approach focused on sharing knowledge on multiple fronts helps to build momentum toward a common end that will benefit everyone. Developing countries are already working to reduce these pollutants for the same reason we are, to save lives, grow more food, and give their children a chance at a better future. To briefly conclude, given the abundant benefits demonstrated here of cooperation with foreign partners in projects outside of the United States, and given the absolute necessity for international cooperation to adequately address problems that cannot effectively be stopped at anyone's borders, it would be irresponsible to limit EPA as this bill proposes. Of course, I agree that we need to reduce budgets across the board in the federal government. No one could argue otherwise. But if we must trim 103 grant programs, better to use a scalpel than a sledgehammer.
Ms. Derby, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Representative Rush, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Alyssa Derby. I am a senior program officer at Winrock International, and I manage Winrock's household energy programs. Winrock International is a nonprofit organization that works with people in the United States and around the world to empower the disadvantaged, increase economic opportunity, and sustain natural resources. Winrock is headquartered in Little Rock, Arkansas, the state of our namesake, former Governor Winthrop Rockefeller. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Winrock's partnership with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency related to clean, efficient cooking practices. Winrock is one of the grantees being discussed today. I will summarize my testimony for you today to maximize time for your questions. My complete testimony has been submitted for the record. I hope this testimony helps committee members understand the work we have done and the people it has benefited. Some 3 billion people worldwide burn solid fuels like wood, animal dung, crop residues, coal, and charcoal for cooking and heating in open fires or rudimentary stoves, releasing toxic smoke into their homes. Nearly 3 million people, primarily women and children in poor countries, die prematurely each year from exposure to indoor smoke from burning solid fuels, more than from either AIDS or malaria. Pneumonia, also closely associated with exposure to indoor smoke, is the #1 killer of children under 5 worldwide and kills more children than AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. Exposure to indoor smoke is also associated with various cancers, cataracts, tuberculosis, asthma attacks, babies born with low birth weight or stillborn, and early infant death. Time and money spent on gathering and buying fuel perpetuates the cycle of family poverty. While I'm not an expert on this issue, we do know that there are direct links between international poverty and U.S. national security. The inefficient burning of wood and charcoal also increases pressures on local natural resources and contributes to emissions of greenhouse gases and black carbon. In short, the simple task of cooking family meals has serious negative health and socioeconomic implications for half the world's population and serious negative environmental impacts locally and globally. Fortunately, there are clear solutions to these problems. Winrock, EPA, and a host of national, international, and private sector partners have worked to promote low-cost but clean and efficient approved cook stoves to address these problems since 2002 under the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air, which we'll refer to as PCIA, launched as a presidential initiative of George W. Bush and led by EPA, now through ongoing work of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, EPA, and other U.S. government agencies. I personally have witnessed the damaging health and safety effects of indoor air pollution in homes I've visited in Latin America and Asia, and the impact that a clean, efficient cook stove can have on their lives. Women have shared with me that with an improved cook stove, they cough less and their children stay healthier. They say they have more time to spend with their children, and more money for food and school as a result of the reduced fuel needs of the improved stoves. They're horrified to realize that the soot coating their walls and ceiling from their old stove was also coating their children's lungs. As a recognized global leader and expert in indoor air quality, EPA's involvement in this work has lent important prestige to the improved cook stove sector that has enabled tremendous accomplishments and growth and development of the sector over the past 8 years that would not have been possible otherwise. Over the 6 years that we monitored PCIA partner achievements, PCIA partners reported selling and distributing more than 9.3 million improved stoves, benefiting approximately 52 million people around the world. Winrock takes seriously our important role as stewards of U.S. taxpayer dollars. As such, we are firmly committed to cost-effective and efficient use of funds and always require significant participant cost share for all travel scholarships used to bring participants to our high-impact and low-cost technical trainings. Participants that receive airfare support are responsible for all other travel costs, including meals and lodging. The overwhelming majority of the grant funding that Winrock has received from EPA for this partnership was spent here in the United States. At no time have any funds been transferred to any foreign government or other foreign entity. We believe that the work EPA has funded to date related to clean and efficient cook stoves has been pioneering and vital to the sector, and we have been proud to play a role in these achievements. Ultimately, this effort will lead to more people using better technologies and practices, reducing their exposure to indoor smoke, and thereby improving their health, livelihood, and quality of life. I appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Derby. Dr. Kreutzer, is it
Kreutzer?
Kreutzer. Dr. Kreutzer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
My name is David Kreutzer. I am Research Fellow in Energy Economics and Climate Change at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush and other members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me to address you on the issue of EPA grants to foreign recipients. Though there may well be legitimate concerns about the appropriateness of funding environmental activities abroad, especially given our national debt and the fraction of our debt that is held by one of the leading recipient countries, a greater concern is what this tells us about our government's vision for much more significant obligations. That the EPA funds environmental programs in foreign countries is a clear sign that these countries are unwilling to fund these programs themselves. Though there are serious disagreements about the impact of CO2 emissions, climate skeptics, climate activists, the EPA, and others all agree the growth of CO2 emissions over the next century will come predominantly, if not entirely, from the developing countries. For example, in 2002, China's CO2 emissions were 40% less than those in the United States, while this year they are at least 50% greater. And this trend is likely to continue. The CO2 emissions coming from the developing world are growing much faster than they will from the developed world. Even accepting the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's high-end estimate of climate sensitivity, and that's a measure of how much warming there will be for a doubling of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, even accepting those numbers, it is acknowledged that cutting CO2 emissions in the U.S. alone, or even in conjunction with the Annex I countries, that is the developed countries, of the Kyoto Agreement, will moderate any global warming by less than 0.5 degree by the end of this century. Whenever this point was made in the debates over cap-and-trade bills, for instance, the proponents of the legislation would imply that the emerging economies would follow our lead. What these proponents usually left out was that we would have to pay them to follow our lead. And why should they want to voluntarily? Last summer, there was a headline that said half of India was without electricity. That was due to a blackout. The week before, they could have had a headline that said 1/3 of India is without electricity, because they are always without electricity, all right? And so they are looking at having phenomenal growth rates. They would like everybody to have electricity. They would like them to have more than just electricity. They like them to have refrigerators and dishwashers and all the things that we have. It's going to take a phenomenal amount of money to bribe them to forego those things, that growth that they would get by using energy. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change established a $100 billion green climate fund as sort of the first ante to help transfer this wealth from the developed world to the developing world to get them to comply with the carbon restrictions. What the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change left out was the actual funding part of this fund. But I think we can get an idea by simply looking at past legislation in the U.S. The Lieberman-Warner Cap-and-Trade Bill had provisions for designating U.S. money to go to foreign programs, as did the Waxman-Markey Cap-and-Trade Bill, as did the Kerry-Boxer Cap-and-Trade Bill, as did the Kerry-Lieberman Cap-and-Trade Bill. EPA funding of foreign environmental programs is a clear sign that foreign countries are unwilling to fund these programs themselves. It should be noted that the cost of these programs is a small fraction of the cost of those necessary for these countries to meet carbon emission targets set out by proponents of global warming policies. So this is yet another sign that any carbon legislation in the U.S., whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade, is likely to obligate U.S. energy consumers to bear not only the burden of our own policies, but the additional burden of paying foreign countries for their compliance. There's near universal agreement that without severe restrictions on the carbon emissions of the developing countries, no policy in the developed world will have sufficient impact for them to meet the targets that are being set out, the ones that I oppose, by the way. Though unadvertised, this significant additional burden of paying for the developing world's compliance is known to those involved in climate negotiations and policy making. The UN has established a fund that will require developed countries to contribute hundreds of billions of dollars. U.S. energy consumers may not know about this obligation, but those negotiating supposedly on their behalf do. That every major cap-and-trade bill in the U.S. included mechanisms for contributing to this fund or ones like it makes it clear that climate policymakers in the U.S. intend to acquiesce to these demands for our wealth. Taken in this context, the EPA grants may just be the camel's nose in the tent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kreutzer, and thank all of you for your testimony. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and then the other members will ask questions as well. Dr. Simmons, I know that, or Mr. Simmons, in your testimony you talked about the executive order that President Clinton had and President Obama had, and in which it basically was saying that agencies should not issue grants other than as explicitly set out in the legislation or the statute. Can you make an argument based on that executive order that EPA may be violating that executive order with their 103 grants?
Well, I mean, I need to be clear on this. The executive order is the regulatory philosophy, and there is obviously a difference between regulations and between grant making. And my argument is that grant making ought to be, and how they decide grant making ought to be analogous to how they should be following the regulatory philosophy. So, I mean, I think it definitely violates the spirit of the executive order, but there's been unfortunately, there's been a long-standing.
Well, there has been long-standing, and I agree with you. I think it does violate the spirit of it, and I don't really agree with EPA that it's very clear in the Section 103 statute that they have the authority to do these international grants, but I think primarily they're relying on their NEPA authority, and I don't know that that's ever been tested in the courts. Do you know if it has?
My understanding, well, yes, I don't know, and I mean, Section 103 says that EPA has the authority to, quote, establish a national research and development program for the prevention and control of air pollution. It says it's a national program. It doesn't, by not explicitly limiting EPA's authority, is why we're in the situation.
And Ms. Derby, all of us have heard of Winrock International. We know that you all do great work and that you are here testifying. You're not trying to hide anything. And on your website it talks about, and you said in your testimony, you receive grants from the federal government. And you list agencies that you receive grants from. how much would you say that you receive a year in grants from the federal government for Windrock?
I don't have that number, but I would estimate that at least $60 million a year.
16 million? Okay.
60.
Oh, 60 million.
Yeah, it fluctuates from year.
Because I know you have foundations that support you and even federal agencies outside the U.S. and so forth. But I'm glad that you and Dr. Light are here because, as I said in my opening statement, this is more symbolic than anything else. We have a gigantic federal debt, and everyone that comes up here to testify, they always say, I agree that we need to be more focused on reducing our debt. But anytime we ever come up with even a minor way to do it, everyone says, oh my God, we can't do that. And now here we're talking about EPA. They have a budget over $8 billion a year. And we're talking about less than 1% of that on these 103 grants. And I mean, I find it difficult to believe in all the hearings that I've been a part of, listening to EPA testify up here, all of their programs, that they would be damaged in any significant way, or that the American people would be damaged in any significant way by eliminating these grants. Obviously, you don't feel that way, Dr. Light, and I guess you don't feel that way either. Is that right, Ms. Derby?
Yes. Can I respond?
Sure.
Yeah. So all of Windrock's household energy technical training work has been funded by EPA. And so if this legislation should pass, then that possibility going forward would be eliminated. But not just for Windrock, for all of the improved cook stove sector. And because EPA is a leading recognized expert in indoor air quality, their involvement has been very important to the sector.
And let me just interject here. Mr. McKinley talked about this, and he talks about it every hearing. Every time EPA comes up here, we talk about indoor air quality being worse than outdoor air, and they seldom, if ever, focus any attention on indoor air, and yet through these grants, they're concerned about indoor air problems outside the U.S.
EPA, well, I can't represent EPA, but I know EPA does work on indoor air quality in the United States.
Not much.
I would have to defer to EPA on.
Well, does anybody else have any comment? My time's expiring. Yes.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this. I think it's actually, there's certainly a place for putting forth a piece of legislation that to make the symbolic argument you're making. I think that the consensus view that Ms. Derby and I have, and many of the other people who work in this area, and my review of the scientific literature, is that unfortunately the impact would not be symbolic. That it effectively would have a very big impact on our ability to fight pollution that is harming Americans. And it might sound like a very small amount of money from the EPA budget, but as you say, the EPA budget is very large. And so compared to what a lot of other countries commit into to efforts like this, even a small amount of our budget actually goes quite a long way, especially with respect to leveraging private finance to even increase the pots of money available for reducing these pollutants.
Thank you. Dr. Kreitzer?
Yes. Again, I would like to take a somewhat bigger picture view. I don't have any problem, I don't think, with our cook stove at our house because it's electric. And it's electric because we have economic growth and we have power plants. I think in Virginia, probably a majority is from coal. And while it's noble, and I think a good idea, to improve the cook stoves that are using gathered wood or dung or whatever the source may be, it's ironic that at the same time that the EPA is funding this project, they're working so hard to prevent the electrification or the use of coal that can provide a much cleaner indoor environment by allowing people, 1/3, as I mentioned, in India, don't even have electricity. One of the cheapest source of electricity for them will be coal, but we have almost a jihad against coal here in the U.S., spearheaded by the EPA. So I think it would be more consistent if they were really worried about indoor air pollution to come up with ways to help the developing world to get electricity that's affordable and reliable.
Right. Good. Yeah, very good. Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I agree with Dr. Light that this is more than just symbolism. This is anytime we spend this much time on a bill and these much resources, I hope that it's not just about symbolism. But Dr. Kreutzer, he raised some interesting points. You know, and he used a word that kind of rattled me a little bit. He accused us of trying to bribe governments, foreign governments, or with these funds. How do you react to that? And how do you react to his overall statement?
Yes, sir. I would not agree with Mr. Kreutzer that these are bribes that we're giving to other governments. I don't think that that's the way the fundamental leveraging of finance works out in these cases. The sort of the trajectory of his argument was that this is the camel's nose under the tents, and what's down the road is by 2020 this big green climate fund, which is supposed to raise the bulk of a commitment for $100 billion. But the way that Mr. Kreutzer characterized this in his testimony, there were just many errors. He says, for example, that the U.S. is expected to make the biggest contribution to international climate finance. Well, while some people might expect that, that certainly isn't how this administration has characterized what they plan on contributing to funds like these. He also suggested towards the end of his testimony that setting up these big funds like this will require developed countries to contribute hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's just simply not the way they're set up. In fact, if you look at the Green Climate Fund and many of the other climate funds around the world, including the current ones that exist in the World Bank and others, the United States has always said public money cannot be used to fill all these coffers. That is the consistent position of this administration. And the United States, in fact, held up the implementing document for the Green Climate Fund before last year's climate summit in Durban because it did not have sufficient, it did not sufficiently allow for private investment to be one of the key factors of how this fund was going to move forward. In fact, the United States held up the document and said, we will not agree to signing on to this document moving forward until there is a significant portal for private investment going forward. This is how the United States looks at this. And so I think that to characterize this as just a big public giveaway globally is just simply false. It is the case that because we've got talking about countries that have excruciating development needs, that they are going to need some assistance to leverage adequate amounts of money to deal with these problems. And the good part is that we all absolutely benefit from this. And I think the numbers are absolutely clear.
So can I chime in since you are talking about my testimony?
Mr. Chairman, I have time. Ms. Derby, I'm very, very excited about your program and what you do and what Winrock does across the world. And when you talked about the cook stove, I recall a time when I was in Chiapas, Mexico, and we walked into this little hut. I mean, and this the smoke. I just could not really understand how they could stay in this one room hut with this cook stove, and it was just so much smoke. The smoke was so thick, and here you had babies and little children, you know, in and out of this place. So I mean, that picture. It's vivid in my mind regarding that. So, can you tell me a little bit about, or can you describe the breadth of support for your work? How many other international organizations support this kind of work? How many? The chairman indicated that you had foundations supporting this kind of work. How much of an international initiative does the matter of cook stoves engender around the world? How much support around the world?
So, well, there are numerous improved cook stove related programs around the world. Many are funded by U.S. government agencies, including there's when the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves was launched, there was a $53 million commitment by the U.S. government. About half of that was committed by CDC and NIH for health studies, and the rest was committed between the Department of Energy, Department of State, USAID, and EPA. The World Bank also works on improved cook stove related and household energy work, as do smaller foundations fund this kind of work. At Winrock, our primary work with improved cook stoves and household energy in general has been through USAID and EPA funding.
So if, in fact, this bill were to become law, then it would have a cascading effect on a reverberation on these other programs and these other initiatives around the world. Is that correct?
I believe so, because EPA has been a pioneering leader in the sector and has been able to leverage the involvement of other U.S. government and international agencies. And so to have EPA suddenly pull out from the sector would be a tremendous blow to the sector.
What would it do to our foreign image? I mean, our image around the world as it relates to being a leader in terms of environmental.
Well, the U.S. is definitely, thanks to EPA, currently recognized as a leader in household energy and indoor air pollution and cook stoves work. That right now, the EPA is funding technical trainings around the world to help people learn to make better cook stoves and make sure that they work right. You can't tell by looking at a cook stove if it works right. You have to test it. So all of this training that we're doing increases U.S. visibility and goodwill abroad by us helping these producers to make their stoves better and thereby improve health and livelihood for families.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kreitzer, good, nice to see you and welcome you here. You, a couple times, wanted to make some comments in the last couple of minutes, and I'm going to give you that opportunity.
Oh, well, thank you. The first, and I'll talk about the most recent topic, which is these cook stoves, and I think it's a noble initiative. The trouble is the EPA seems to want to create a world that's ideal for subsistence farmers, as we want to help them with the technologies that they have when they're poor. We do not want to help promote technologies and energy sources that are going to allow them to become rich. And I think that's misguided. As great a program as I think the one you have now is, ignoring the second half is even worse in greater magnitude. Dr. Light accused me of making some misrepresentations regarding these global funds. He said the administration does not want public funds to go to them. The administration supported the Waxman-Markey bill, the Kerry-Boxer bill, the Kerry-Lieberman bill, all of which had provisions for sending funds to these foreign programs. They were not actually tax dollars because they used the disingenuous plan of calling something allowances. That is, energy producers would have to buy allowances. That would generate funds, and it's those funds that are going overseas. That's exactly it. If you talk to all the economists, they agree that it works very much like a CO2 tax, and we can call those allowances CO2 tax revenues. Every person I know that did modeling on both sides of the aisle of the cap and trade bills regarded those as carbon taxes. Maybe officially they weren't, but sending money from energy consumers in the U.S. to foreign countries to try to get them to do something they clearly don't want to do because it's going to be very costly in terms of limiting their growth, I think is a bad idea, and I think it was hidden in these negotiations. I don't think they advertised the fact that there was going to be a big amount of money transferred.
Mr. Simmons, if I might, and it's one of those things that sometimes happens, I think I misheard your testimony, so I want to make sure that it's clear, because then when I went back to read it, because I thought it was a really good point, I read it differently than I heard it. So let me make sure I get it clear. In your testimony, you stated that in regard to the mercury and toxic standards rule, that the EPA website indicates that it costs $10 billion a year. And then what I thought I heard you say was that the EPA said that it had a value of $6 billion, but I noticed in your written testimony that it's an M. I'm assuming your written testimony, so it's a $6 million benefit. I'm assuming your written testimony is correct in that I just wasn't paying enough attention.
I could have easily misspoken. It is in EPA's regulatory impact analysis, it is the cost of the mercury and air toxic standard is $10 billion a year. The benefits for reducing mercury are between $500,000 and $6 million with an M dollars.
And so that does leave a huge amount of money that could be used for other projects. And I see this all the time where it appears that the EPA is either making others spend a lot of money or they're spending money, and yet we could take that money and use it for something that really matters, like the cook stoves, and do things in this country. And then I also liked your point in regard to the economic situations, because my district is being hit very hard by what I believe Dr. Greitzer, I always call it the war on coal. You used, what was it, Armageddon on coal? What was the term you used?
I didn't mean to bring a religious component into this.
You go back to my war on coal.
War is fine.
But,
Thank you.
But we're you know, we're on the front lines of that. We lost another 620 jobs just last week that are idled. Hopefully they'll come back in the not too distant future. But prior to that, we've had over 1,000 people in the region that have been laid off from various mines. And, you know, it's interesting because we're talking about the cook stoves in third world countries, but I envision in a cold winter, and we did not have a cold winter this last winter, a lot of folks in my district are going to have to live in one room, even if they have a multi-room house, with some type of a small little heater, probably either electric or kerosene, because they can't afford to heat the whole house to a level that's comfortable. And even in that small room, they're going to have to be bundled up. And does that not have greater effect, Mr. Simmons, on the health of those individuals than the value of the mats compared with the $10 billion a year?
It has a large impact. I mean, there is a great discrepancy between the health outcomes of the poor versus the rich, and it has everything to do with which people and rich countries can afford more environmental amenities than poor people and poor countries. And so the point is, the richer we are as people, the richer we are as a country, the safer we are and the better our environment is.
And Mr. Chairman, I see my time is up, and I yield back.
Thanks very much, Mr. Griffith, and I want to thank all four of you for taking time to come up today and talking about this legislation and the impact that it would have from your perspective. We appreciate your time once again, and we're going to keep this record open for at least 10 days. If you have any additional material that anyone would like to put in, the record will be open. And Mr. Rush, do you have anything else? No, thank you. Sorry, we're not going to have a hearing tomorrow, but anyway, thank you all very much, and we look forward to working with you as we decide whether to move forward or not. Thank you very much. Hearing's concluded.